It's all right. We're safe in here.
What would you do if in the middle of a cold, rainy night in the jungle, you heard a baby's cry coming from the darkness? Martha Reese did. She was 52, living alone in a cabin at the edge of quiet pines, carrying 15 years of guilt over a child lost on her watch. But that night, when she followed the sound with trembling hands and a flickering oil lamp, she didn't find a child. She found something else, a small creature, trembling like a toddler, eyes like ours, fur soaked in rain. No footprints of its parents, only chaos in the mud. She couldn't leave it behind to freeze. When she picked it up, it pressed its face to her chest and matched her breathing. She named him Whisper. What followed was more than survival. It was a bond of trust, warmth, and healing. Whisper learned to mimic her size, cling to her presence, and draw clumsy sketches of someone holding a child. Not just a creature. He remembered. He felt. But the forest was never truly quiet. Someone, or something, began watching the cabin. Strange symbols, broken branches, and one day, a massive figure in the woods, with eyes that didn't look wild but weary, like a father searching for his child. And when the truth unfolded, it wasn't a horror story. It was something far rarer, a sacred moment of trust between species. If you stay with this story, you'll witness how a myth became family, how a creature once hunted gave thanks, and how one woman in the heart of the woods finally found peace through a love beyond language. But now, dear viewer, where are you watching from? What's your name? How far can this story travel? From one heart to another. If this tale moved you even a little, tap that like button and consider subscribing. Let's grow a community where stories like Whispers have a home, where Bigfoot isn't a monster, but a mystery worth loving. From the heart of the forest, thank you truly for being here. The air held that familiar Arkansas weight. Springtime warm, but damp. Heavy with the kind of rain that didn't fall, just hung in the trees like it was thinking things through. Out past the town's edge where quiet pines began its hush, there stood an old cabin stitched together with nailheads, flaking green paint, and the memory of voices it hadn't heard in a long time. Inside, Martha Reese sat by the window, listening to the low creak of the rocking chair that only moved when she made it. 52. And she'd folded her life into this cabin the way someone folds a letter they're too ashamed to send. She hadn't taught in 15 years, not since the trip that ended with one child missing and a town full of blame that didn't know where else to land. The rain tapped soft against the window, polite at first. Then it came harder, drumming on the roof like fingers on a hollow door. She looked out and saw nothing but mist rising from the soaked needles of the pine line. There was no wind, just that deep forest quiet, the kind that tricks your ears into listening too hard. Then came the sound. It wasn't quite a cry. Not yet. It started thin, high, and sharp, like a whistle caught in a child's throat. Then it dropped, deep and broken. A kind of moan that curled inside the chest and tightened the lungs before the mind had a chance to explain it away. Martha stood so slowly the chair barely noticed she left it. She crossed the room and reached for the old lantern by the door. Her hand hesitated on the knob. That sound was coming from the woods, and not close. A few hundred yards, maybe. Far enough that any sane woman would have stayed inside, blamed it on a fox, a coyote, a figment of the past clawing up through the floorboards of her guilt. But something pulled her out. The lantern swayed in her hand as she stepped into the rain. It hissed as drops hit the hot glass, casting a warm blur across her face. Her boots sank into the mud past the porch. The trees waited, watching. She moved forward, eyes locked on nothing, ears hunting that sound. It came again, shorter this time, like it was getting tired. Her breath caught. 15 years ago, there'd been another sound like that. A scream that never finished. a little girl's jacket found torn near the creek. They said Martha should have kept better count. They said the forest swallowed kids who didn't know better. Martha never stopped hearing that scream. The trail behind her cabin was barely a path anymore, just a suggestion of where deer had passed, or maybe her own boots years ago. The rain whispered through the pines, dripping in steady rhythm. The light from her lantern caught droplets midair like floating glass. She found it near the old lightning-blasted pine, the one with the hollow at its base that squirrels used to own. A small figure curled beneath the roots, too still. Dark fur soaked and clinging, arms wrapped around thin knees. It couldn't have been more than 2.5 feet tall. At first, her mind tried to name it Bear Cub. But no bear had a face like that. Its eyes opened when the light found it, wide and flat with pupils that didn't shrink. They were wet with something more than rain. Its breath came in shallow pulls. Then it made that sound again, and it wasn't an animal sound. It was cracked, personal. It sounded like it hurt. There were no tracks nearby, none that made sense. Just clawed earth and trampled moss, like something large had been here, fast and scared. Then gone. She knelt slowly. The creature didn't move, just watched her through rain-soaked lashes. She reached out. Its body was cold, shivering, and so light in her arms it felt like something half real. When she lifted it, it clung to her shirt with slow fingers, pressed its face into her chest, and stayed there. The strangest thing, its breathing shifted to match hers, in and out, in and out. Like it was learning the rhythm of safety. She stood, lantern swinging, holding it close as she turned back toward the cabin. Her hands trembled. Inside, the cabin looked smaller somehow, like it had been waiting for them. She placed the creature on the old couch and fetched the blanket she never used. It didn't resist, just curled into the heat like it understood something sacred had happened. She moved around the room in silence, hands busy, heart louder than any storm. When she returned with warm cloths and a bowl of water, it was watching her. Not like an animal, not even like a child, like something trying to understand why she'd come back for it. She whispered, "You're safe now." Not because it could understand the words, but because she had to say them aloud. The rain kept on. Somewhere deep in the woods, something moved, but not toward the cabin, not yet. That night she barely slept. It lay near the fire, curled beneath a quilt she hadn't unfolded in years. Every so often it would shift, its breath hitching like it remembered something painful. Once, it reached a hand out in sleep, fingers curling toward the empty space where she sat in the chair across the room. She didn't move, just watched. By morning it still hadn't made another sound. But when she crouched beside it, it opened its eyes and looked straight at her. And then, just for a second, it placed its hand over her chest. Not hard, just resting there, as if it was checking something. She said, "Whisper." The name slipped out of her mouth like it had been waiting. "You're like the wind out there. Quiet, but I hear you anyway." The creature blinked once. She nodded to herself. "Whisper." Later that day, she walked the forest again, retraced her steps back to the lightning-blasted pine. The ground told no more stories. Whatever had been there was gone. But the chaos in the soil, the deep drag marks, the torn moss, it spoke of panic, of something being taken, or left behind. No blood, no bones. But her gut told her something had gone wrong. Whisper hadn't just gotten lost. She started keeping the lantern lit longer each night. Cooked in silence. Waited. Watched. That second evening, as she stirred oats over the wood stove, she glanced over and saw him, sitting upright, watching the spoon move in circles. Its eyes tracking the motion like it meant something. When she tapped the wooden handle on the side of the pot, he flinched. Not in fear, in mimicry, as if trying to remember the rhythm. When she served the warm mix in a shallow bowl, he sniffed it carefully, tasted it, then took another bite. Later, he would sit close to the fire, knees tucked up, hands near the warmth like someone who knew comfort only from stories. And that night he slept with one arm stretched out toward her chair. She didn't know what he was, but she knew why he was there. That much was clear. There's a kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It just happens in the spaces between two broken things. 15 years ago, a child vanished under her watch. Martha had buried that failure under logs of routine and silence, but something in Whisper's breath against her collarbone had cracked it open again. He was left behind, but not by accident. She could feel it. The ground at that pine hadn't told the full truth, but it told enough. That night, just past midnight, she awoke to the sound again. A cry, but this time, not from inside the cabin. It came from the woods. The same tone, the same 2 layers, high, then low. Just once, Whisper stirred, eyes wide, but he didn't make a sound. He just looked at her. She stepped to the window. Darkness, rain, pines bending in the breeze. Nothing moved. The forest was watching, and so was something inside it. Martha turned, walked back to the fire, and lowered herself into the rocking chair. Whisper was watching her, breathing slow, matching her again. Outside, something cracked. A branch, maybe, or a footstep too heavy for any deer. But it didn't come closer. It was waiting. So was she. And across that silence stretched the beginning of something neither of them had asked for. But it had come anyway, just like the rain, just like regret, just like love. By morning the storm had passed, but the world outside still dripped like it was recovering from something bigger than weather. The sky hung low, pale and swollen with leftover rain clouds. The forest breathed quiet again, but not peace. Something had changed. Inside the cabin, the stove hissed a little. The fire hadn't gone out completely. Martha stirred it back to life with a practiced hand. Her other hand moved slower, cradling the tin kettle as it poured warm water into the chipped basin on the wooden table. She glanced sideways. The creature, the boy, the being she'd called Whisper, still slept near the fire. Curled tight, not like a baby, not quite like an animal either. His fur was darker now that it had dried, a deep brown that caught amber at the tips. His arms were longer than a child's, but not misshapen. His face, it had a shape that pulled her eyes back again and again, brow low, nose broad, no snout, no muzzle. Human, but not. Ancient, but unfinished. She dipped a rag into the warm water and wrung it out. Kneeling beside him, she whispered, "Hey now, let's try to get you clean." His eyes opened. Not with surprise, not even with fear, just quiet watching. He didn't flinch when she touched his arm, only breathed in fast through his nose. When she rubbed the cloth down his shoulder, he winced, not from pain, but from cold maybe, or just the strangeness of being touched by someone with no fur. Martha worked carefully, wiped away dried mud, pine needles, tiny burrs caught in the thick strands. He didn't stop her. When she found a small scrape behind his ear, she pressed a little salve on it. Just some old pine resin and beeswax she still kept in a tin from years back. He blinked slow, then tucked his head lower, toward the warmth of her elbow. It was the kind of trust that didn't come from knowing someone. It came from losing everything else. Afterward, she wrapped him in one of the flannel blankets. He stayed close to the wood stove, gravitating toward the warmth like he'd been born in winter and never left. She made a bed of towels and old quilts right next to the hearth. That's where he decided to sleep again. No prompting. Curled on his side, back to the wall, always facing the room. Food was the next puzzle. She tried oatmeal, too hot. He pushed the bowl back. Then a slice of apple, peeled. He sniffed it, held it, didn't bite. Bananas, too squishy. Crackers, chewed one, then spat it back out, nose wrinkling. She didn't blame him. Finally, she warmed a little milk with honey on the stove. When she placed the mug in front of him, he stared for a while, touched it with one finger, then lifted it, sniffed deep, and drank. A slow, rhythmic sipping, eyes half closed. Later that day, she mashed up a few dates and pink apples into a thick pulp and warmed it. He ate all of it, quietly, spoon by spoon, licking the inside of the bowl afterward. But he wouldn't touch meat. Not bacon, not broth, not even dried jerky softened in water. When she offered him a bit of roasted chicken from her stew, he looked at her like she'd just broken something between them. Didn't take a bite for the rest of the evening. Didn't look at her for a while either. That night, he curled even closer to the stove, but not to sleep. She could see it, his eyes tracking every sound, the kettle clicking as it cooled, the wind tapping something loose on the roof, her chair creaking. He didn't mimic them yet, but he stored them. By the third day, he started to echo. It began with a breath. She sighed while folding laundry, long and low from the bottom of her ribs. A few seconds later, from near the fire, she heard it again. Not hers, his, perfect copy. Then the sound of the old door hinge when she stepped out onto the porch. He made that too. Mouth closed, but throat engaged, a high squeak that faded down. The next evening, he startled her. She dropped a wooden spoon on the floor, and when she bent to pick it up, she heard him whisper behind her, "Warm." She froze, turned. He sat cross-legged on the rug, arms on his knees, looking right at her. The word had come out strange, wrapped in a soft rasp, but it was there. "Warm," she said again, slower. He blinked, touched his chest, then pointed to the stove. They did that for hours. One word, 2 syllables, back and forth. Every time he said it, he sounded more sure. On the 5th night, something changed. She'd locked the front door, same as always, and banked the fire to last till morning. The cabin dipped into its usual silence, the kind that stretched thin across the rafters and hummed between floorboards. Outside, the forest had gone still, too still. Sometime near midnight, whispers stirred, then froze. His head turned toward the window. She sat up from her chair without thinking, one hand reaching behind her to the iron poker by the stove. He scurried under the table, moving fast, silent. There was no knock, just the slow, deliberate creak of the porch. One board, then another. She held her breath, then the sound stopped. She stepped to the window, careful not to cast a shadow on the glass. Nothing there, but her gut said different. When she opened the door in the morning, she saw it. A handprint, dark mud, pressed firm against the siding near the door frame. Bigger than hers. Older. The fingers splayed a little, crooked. The kind of hand that didn't belong to a boy, didn't belong to any creature in these woods she'd ever known. She looked at Whisper. He was already watching her. That afternoon, he did something else. He took the ashes from the cold fireplace, the fine gray powder left from the night's burn, and he dipped his fingers into it. Then, with slow, careful movements, he drew on the floorboards, a wide arc, then a small circle nestled within it. Martha stared. He looked up at her, then back at the shape, put one hand flat inside the circle, then both arms, wrapping them around it. It was a hug, a gesture, a memory, a mother. She felt something in her chest shift, like a room that had been closed off suddenly opening again, air rushing in. He wasn't copying her this time. He was remembering something he'd seen. Someone he missed. Someone who might not be coming back. That night she left the lantern burning, just in case. She sat beside his bedroll, reading an old paperback she couldn't focus on. Every so often, she glanced over at him. His eyes fluttered in sleep, hands twitching like he was still drawing. The cabin felt warmer than usual. Not because of the fire, because it wasn't empty anymore. The rain came back in patches over the next few days. The forest stayed thick with that green scent of growing things. But something beyond the trees felt heavier now, watched, Not hostile, not yet. She started listening differently, stepping lighter, letting the wind speak longer before she moved. She caught herself humming at the sink once, and heard the echo come from near the fire, soft and off-key. He was learning her, not just mimicking, mapping the inside of the life she'd built here, the rhythms, the quiet, the shape of comfort. One morning she walked outside and saw tiny marks in the soil beyond the porch. Not footprints, just drag lines, like something had squatted low and crawled closer to the cabin on all fours. Too big to be a raccoon, too deliberate to be a deer. She swept them away with a broom. When she came back inside, he was watching her. Again. But this time, she thought, maybe she wasn't just protecting him. Maybe he was trying to protect her too. And somewhere, someone else was still searching for what they'd lost. But for now, the fire stayed lit. And the cabin, for the first time in years, felt alive. By June, the forest had shaken off the wet hush of spring and stood taller under the sun. Pines sharpened their edges. The dirt trail behind the cabin warmed faster in the morning, the needles crunching softer beneath boots. But even with the season shifting toward heat and bloom, something in quiet pines still moved with a strange restraint, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Martha had noticed it first in the birds. They weren't singing as much. The chickadees, the mourning doves, silent more often than not. Then there was the night 3 dogs barked all at once, in 3 different corners of town, and stopped at the same second. That's when people started whispering again, same way they had 15 years ago. Strange noises up near the ridge. Someone had told her at the post office, standing too close in line. Heard like a woman crying one second, then something else the next, real low, not human. Martha had nodded politely, kept her voice flat, eyes steady. Foxes make sounds like that, or bobcats. The man had squinted. No, ma'am, not this time. This was like singing, but wrong. By July, the name stuck, Ghost Choir in the Pines. A joke, maybe, or maybe not. Folks love to laugh when they're scared. Martha stayed quiet. She always had. But inside the cabin, the air had changed again. Whisper no longer slept as deeply. He had grown more in 2 months than she thought possible. His frame was stronger now, bones stretching, muscles shaping beneath the thickened fur. Not taller, not yet, but there was a presence to him now. A weight, even in stillness. And the sounds he copied, they weren't just mimicry anymore. She first noticed it when she sneezed. Quick, loud, sharp. He didn't echo her. He said, "Stay," then softer, warm. 2 words, together, hesitant but deliberate. She had dropped the dish towel. He had blinked, calm, and placed one hand on her arm like it was his turn to tell her what mattered. He watched the door more often now, watched her too, especially when she stepped out alone. If she moved toward the trail without him, he would block her path, silently, never aggressive, just there. Breathing slow, eyes wide, like a guard who didn't want to fight, but would if he had to. That was the week she met Derek Floyd. 28, fresh face, boots that hadn't quite earned their scuffs. The new forest ranger. Drove up in a government truck with a clipboard and a kind of smile that didn't know yet what this place could do to someone. He introduced himself at the edge of her property, said he'd been reassigned here from somewhere near Helena, had a background in environmental science and wildlife tracking, offered to help patch her fence without her asking. She liked that he didn't talk too much, and that he knocked before walking up her porch. On his 3rd visit, they sat on the steps with lemonade. Whisper stayed hidden inside, though she knew he was listening. Derek had pointed toward the eastern ridge. "We found something last week. Strangest thing." Martha didn't look up from her cup. "Long strands of fur," he said. "Caught up high in the low branches, about 6 feet off the ground. Soft like deer, but the length, I don't know. Looked like hair. Human hair. Brown, a little silver in it." She kept her breath even. "Maybe a bear." He shook his head. "I've seen plenty of black bears. This wasn't coarse. It was finer, straighter, almost groomed." Her fingers tensed around the glass. Derek smiled like he was letting her in on a secret. "Between you and me, I don't think we've cataloged everything that walks these woods." He never asked why her back porch light stayed on till sunrise. That night, the cabin walls creaked louder. Whisper stood for a long time beside the window, listening. His shoulders had filled out. His arms hung a little lower now, fingertips twitching when wind brushed the siding. And then came the music. Not from the cabin, from the woods, high, then dipping. Notes that broke halfway through. A rhythm that didn't settle. No melody, but something close. Like a flute being played by someone who'd never seen one. Only dreamed about it. Whisper folded to the ground like his legs had gone soft. Covered his ears. Rocked slightly. Martha rushed to him. His breath came in short gulps. His eyes wide, full of something rawer than fear. "Recognition, they're calling," she whispered, even though she knew he couldn't understand. "Aren't they?" He groaned, deep and low, a sound that started in his stomach and barely made it out his throat. Not pain, not language. Something in between. He didn't sleep that night. Neither did she. 2 days later, Derek came back with a plaster cast. He knocked, but she didn't open the door. He left it by the porch swing with a note tucked underneath. "Found this near Dry Creek. Not bear, not human. Let me know what you think." The cast was nearly 16 inches long, 5 inches wide. Toes broad and separated. No arch, no shoe, obviously. The weight in the heel told her everything she needed to know. Martha stood staring at it long after the sun had gone down. Whisper stood behind her, silent. He stepped forward, crouched low, and ran one finger along the edge of the print, then pressed his own foot into the soil beside it. Smaller, but same shape. He looked at her. He knew. That night she heard him whisper again, "Stay, worm." But the tone was different this time. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a warning. She bolted the door tighter than before, closed the shutters, set the kettle on even though she wasn't thirsty. Whisper sat cross-legged by the fire, gaze never leaving the front door. Later, just past midnight, she heard the sound again. Not the flute, not the cry. A knock, not on wood, on glass. She turned toward the back window, but it was empty. Then another knock. The front door. She froze. Whisper didn't move. Another knock, soft, polite, almost human. She stepped forward, slow, heart hammering. The shotgun she hadn't touched in a decade leaning just out of reach. She opened the door. Nothing, but the pine trees swayed without wind. She stepped outside, just a foot. Her boot hit something. A carved stick, rough but intentional, bent into a curve. She picked it up, ran her fingers along the smooth groove at its center. It made no sense. But Whisper stepped beside her and nodded. And somewhere beyond the clearing, just before the darkness swallowed the last light of her lantern, she thought she saw movement. Not close, but watching, waiting, and above them, from deep in the forest, the music started again. But this time, more than one voice. Low, layered, calling, and Whisper began to cry. Autumn arrived in quiet pines without asking permission. The first cold edge in the wind came like a whisper through the screen door one morning, nudging Martha from sleep before the sun had even bothered to show. She sat in the kitchen, staring at her coffee as the trees outside rustled with a voice that sounded older than the season itself. It had been over a year since Whisper entered her life, and nothing, not the forest, not her cabin, not her bones, felt the same. He had grown taller, stronger, though he still moved with that same careful grace, like the world could break if he wasn't gentle. His eyes had changed too. They watched not just people now, but symbols, patterns, shapes in clouds and shadows, as if he were reading something hidden in the edges of things. She saw the first sign that morning on a walk she hadn't planned to take. The path behind the cabin twisted along the ridge, framed by firs that bowed under their own age. It wasn't far from the hollow pine where she'd first found him. And just beyond that curve, beneath a cluster of moss and damp leaves, she saw 3 marks carved into a thick trunk. At first, she thought it was a bear again, marking territory. But these weren't wild. They were deliberate. 3 spiraled grooves, each one tight and even, forming a layered spiral as precise as a woodworker's hand. She reached out, ran her fingers over the grooves. They weren't fresh, but they were preserved. Dry, set in. Whisper came up behind her without sound. He looked at the tree, then at her hand, then crouched. With one long nail, he traced the symbol into the dirt, slow and careful. Then he added a dot beside it, a small one. Martha didn't say a word. That night, the wind howled louder through the trees. The kind of wind that pushes old shutters open and stirs memories from places you thought you'd buried them. She stood at the window after dark, watching the treetops sway like dancers refusing to fall. Whisper stood beside her, both hands on the sill, eyes glowing faintly in the lantern light. He was breathing slow, as if syncing with something out there. Not a threat, a rhythm. 2 days later, Derek came knocking again. He hadn't shown up in weeks. Said he'd been downriver helping investigate some bear sightings near Jasper Hollow. But his eyes didn't carry a bear story this time. They carried something closer to disbelief. "You got a minute?" he asked, standing awkward on her porch with a wet hat and muddy boots. She nodded, opened the door wider. He stepped in like he always did, slow, respectful, like the place was older than both of them combined. "I found something," he said, dropping into the chair across from her. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and laid it flat. It was a rubbing, pencil over bark. The same 3 spirals. "Found this carved on a birch near the old mining trail," he said. 10 miles east of here." Martha didn't react. Derek leaned forward. "I've asked around. Nobody in town's ever seen marks like this. I checked old ranger logs, forestry reports, nothing." Still, she didn't speak. He lowered his voice. "But here's the thing, Martha. I followed the trail a little farther, down to the river, and I found footprints." She looked up then. He nodded slowly. "Big ones, straight gait, toes wide, no drag like a bear, 16, maybe 17 inches long, and upright, like a man, but not." He hesitated, then added, "I think you've seen something you're not telling me." Martha held his gaze. The silence stretched. Whisper didn't come out from the back room, but she could feel him listening, just beyond the wall. Finally, she said, "You believe in things science doesn't name." Derek smiled, but it was tired. "I believe in patterns, and I believe in signs that get left behind by things older than our explanations." That evening, Whisper sat at the table long after supper. He wasn't eating. He wasn't drawing. He was staring at the wood grain like it might open up and speak. Then slowly, he reached for a blunt piece of coal she used to mark kindling. He dragged it across the table in 3 tight curves, then paused, then made them again. 3 spirals, 1 small circle below. He looked at her, then at the door. Then he stood and walked to the edge of the room, placing his hand on the wall like he was feeling the heartbeat of the house. She felt her own heart catch. That night he vanished. No door opened, no window broken, just gone. Martha searched for hours, lantern swinging, eyes burning. She called his name out loud, even though she'd never spoken it outside these walls. No answer, just wind and the slow crunch of wet leaves underfoot. She found no tracks, no scent, no hair. But near the tree where the first spiral had been carved, she saw something that froze her blood. Blood, just a little, on the bark, and a long, shallow scrape across the roots, like something had been dragged, resisting. She didn't sleep that night. Sat in the rocker with the shotgun across her knees, the fire nothing but coals. Her hands shook. In the morning, she found him on the porch, curled in a tight ball, bleeding from the shoulder, his fur matted and torn. A long gash stretched down his back, too clean for teeth, too straight for claws. She opened the door, dropped to her knees. "Whisper," she breathed, her hands already searching for cloth, water, anything. He blinked slowly, pain thick behind his lids. When she pressed the cloth to his wound, he didn't flinch. But when she whispered, "Who did this to you?" his mouth opened, and nothing came. He couldn't speak. But his eyes, they looked past her. To the trees. She followed his gaze. Out past the yard. To the forest line, where the wind moved just slightly against the grain of the pines. Something had watched him go. Something had waited for him to be alone. And something had warned him what happens when you walk too far from where you belong. That evening, Whisper sat in the corner, wrapped in a wool blanket, barely breathing. His hands gripped the carved coal stub tight enough to crack it. He drew the spiral again. But this time he added something new, a line through it, cutting it in half. Martha stared. Whatever marked these trees wasn't just communication. It was territory. It was history. It was a warning. And Whisper had crossed it. Later that night, as she sat beside the fire, Martha remembered something from years ago, before the girl had vanished, before the camp trip that ruined her name. An old story from a Lakota teacher who once told her about the people in the quiet trees. Not monsters, not ghosts, just others. The ones who came before, who left signs for those who might come after. And now, the forest was whispering again, but it wasn't calling anymore. It was watching, waiting, and Whisper had survived something that did not want him back. The first gust hit just after sundown, not the soft kind that plays in the pine needles, but the kind that bends the trees at the waist and scrapes across the cabin walls like it's looking for a way in. By the time Martha had locked down the windows and stuffed a towel under the drafty spot near the wood stove, the storm had already begun to speak its own language, the kind made of rattles and distant howls, the kind she hadn't heard since the night her boy was born, all those years ago, when thunder cracked open the roof of the sky and the power went out for 2 days straight. Tonight felt like that, except heavier, like something was coming through the trees with the storm, not just behind it. Whisper had been pacing since early afternoon. He was bigger now, taller than her by several inches, shoulders broader, gait heavier. But there was still something childlike in how he moved when he was nervous. Not erratic, just tight, intentional. His steps kept circling the room, eyes darting to the window every few minutes, as if waiting for something to appear on the other side of the glass. When the lights flickered, he stopped, turned, faced the door. Martha stood near the fireplace, her arms crossed over the same flannel shirt she'd been wearing all week. Her mouth had the beginning of a question in it. But then the wind hit the front of the cabin like a fist. The wood groaned. Whisper growled, low, instinctual, like something buried in his bones had just been shaken awake. Then footsteps. Not inside. Above, muffled, but deliberate. Heavy. Slow. One step, pause. Another. The weight of it made the stovepipe tremble and sent a thin shower of ash drifting down from the chimney like gray snow. Martha's body locked. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She only looked at Whisper. He looked back and nodded. The message passed between them like breath. Something was on the roof. The wind screamed harder then, pushing against the walls so hard the nails seemed to groan in their sockets. The kerosene lantern rattled on its hook. Then came a knock, not on the door, but on the rafters above. Quick, 3 times, like it was testing the thickness of the wood between them. And then it stopped. Silence pressed against the glass. Whisper stayed perfectly still, hands curled slightly, breathing slow. Martha stepped to the door, not to open it, just to feel what was waiting. A second passed. Then, a knock at the front door, but not like before. This one was soft, hesitant. Then a voice. Human. "Martha, it's Derek." She opened the door fast, hand gripping the frame like it might disappear. The ranger stood there, coat soaked, face flushed from the cold. Wind whipped the hood from his head as he leaned in to be heard. "Mind if I ride out the storm in here?" he asked. "Roads are washing out near Mill Creek. The bridge over Flat Run's gone." She stepped aside without a word, shutting the door behind him. He peeled off his coat and gloves, shaking off the cold like a dog shakes off water. This wind could tear a roof off, Then he paused, looked around. Something was off in the way his eyes lingered on the space. Maybe it was the way the firelight didn't stretch all the way into the back room, or maybe it was the way Whisper didn't move. Not yet, but Derek didn't ask. He just lowered himself into the chair by the stove, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The kettle let out a soft hiss as it boiled. Martha moved like muscle memory. Cups, tea leaves, honey kept her back to the door. Behind her, Whisper shifted and stepped into the light. Derek froze, not with fear, with something quieter. Oh, Whisper was tall now, nearly 5 feet even, but not monstrous. His eyes were deep and still. His fur, though dark and damp at the ends, glowed slightly in the fire's breath. His face, broad, flat-nosed, nearly human in shape but ageless in weight, stared back at the ranger without flinching. Derek didn't move. Whisper stepped forward, placed his hand on his own chest, held it there, then bowed slightly. Martha watched Derek's eyes flicker. Not in panic, but calculation. He wasn't reaching for his radio or his sidearm. He was watching, listening. He copied the motion, hand to chest. Slight bow. No words, just breath. Whisper stepped back, returning to his corner by the fire. Martha finally exhaled. Derek said nothing for a long while. Then quietly, "How long?" She didn't answer. Didn't need to. The kettle whistled, sharp and short, and she poured tea for 3 without asking if anyone wanted it. The storm beat against the roof like it was angry about being ignored. The windows rattled in their frames. But the cabin, somehow, held. And then, just before midnight, Derek noticed something at the door. 3 sticks, short, smoothed, arranged carefully into a spiral, slightly open at one end, like a snail shell drawn by someone who knew what it meant but had never seen one before. He crouched to examine them. "Did you put these here?" Martha shook her head. Whisper didn't move. Derek picked one up gently, rolling it between his fingers. "What does it mean?" Whisper stepped forward. Kneeling slowly, he pointed at the shape, then at himself, then at the door, then back at the spiral. He made no sound, but Derek understood. "They're near." Whisper nodded. Derek looked at Martha. "And they don't want to fight." She nodded once, her voice almost gone. "They want respect." He stood. "So do I." And then the wind dropped. Just enough, long enough, for the sound to come through. Not the storm, not the trees. Footsteps, not on the roof, not on the porch, but circling the cabin. Heavy, intentional. And then silence. Long, thick, total. The kind of silence that means something bigger than noise. Whisper stood by the window, eyes wide. Martha joined him. Across the clearing, in the thinnest sliver between trees and moonlight, something moved. Not fast, not close, but seen. A shape, too tall, too broad. Watching, and then gone. Not vanished, just walked back into the dark. Derek stepped beside them, and on the edge of the porch, 3 more sticks waited. Placed where the wind couldn't have dropped them. Another spiral. This one tighter. And this time facing inward, toward the cabin. Whisper stepped outside first. No coat, no shoes. He knelt beside the symbol and added a single stone at the center. Then stood, turned, and closed the door behind him. Martha said nothing. Neither did Derek. Some truths don't need naming. Some warnings don't need translation. And some nights, some sacred, terrible, unforgettable nights, aren't meant to be solved, only witnessed. By the time the ice melted from the creek behind the cabin, Whisper had changed again. The kind of change you don't see in days or inches, but in silence, in posture, in the way a shadow takes up more space on the wall. His shoulders had widened. His step no longer padded like a child's. It landed, steady, slow. 6 feet now, and still growing. When he walked the porch, the boards creaked beneath him. Martha noticed it most in the mornings. He used to sleep in late winters, curled near the stove like a pup beside a hearth. But now he rose with the light, sometimes before it. Standing at the tree line, unmoving, staring into the forest with something between ache and instinct. as if he heard something pulling from deep beneath the roots. He had stopped echoing her sounds weeks ago. Not out of rebellion, just distance. She could feel it even when they sat in the same room, the quiet growing between them. Not heavy, just ancestral. Something in him was remembering itself. One morning she watched him stand by the back door, head tilted slightly, breath fogging the glass. Then he opened it without asking. She followed. The woods were brighter than they should have been, sunlight cutting between the pine trunks like clean blades, air full of thawed mud and the first new moss. Whisper walked a few yards ahead, bare feet pressing into the soil like he belonged to it. Then he stopped. She saw it a moment later. Across the clearing, just beyond the shadow line, stood a figure, taller than Whisper, much taller, 9 feet if not more, broad-shouldered, with arms that hung past the waist, chest thick with coarse fur, broken by long pale scars that caught the light like old rivers on a map. His left leg held strangely stiff, the foot planted carefully. There, wrapping the shin like a faded bracelet, was a crescent-shaped scar, jagged, pink, healed over in a way that could only come from steel. A trap, years old. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, didn't growl or run, just stood there, breathing slow, eyes fixed not on Martha, but on Whisper. The boy didn't step forward, but he didn't retreat either. Martha's breath caught. She didn't say a word. Her body stilled, like bark. The cold wind blew across the space between them, stirring nothing. The creature turned his head slightly, not toward her, toward the cabin, then back to Whisper. Then he was gone, not vanished, just turned and walked back into the woods with a patience that made the trees part for him. Martha and Whisper stood there for another minute, like the moment was still unfolding somewhere behind them. Then Whisper sat down, right there in the dirt. He didn't look at her, didn't speak. But when she joined him, he laid one hand on the earth. Flat. Quiet. Later that day, he began rearranging things inside the cabin. Not out of mischief, not destruction. Order. He moved the blanket near the stove into a tighter roll. Collected stones he'd kept near the door and placed them in a ring by the window. He recentered the rug beneath the table. Then, late that afternoon, he went outside again and didn't return for hours. When he came back, he carried something. A flat stone, round-edged, dark like river slate, with 2 parallel white lines across it. He held it like it meant something sacred. He didn't hand it to Martha. He placed it at the threshold of the door, facing outward. Then he looked at her, touched his chest, then hers, then the doorframe. No words, just breath. 2 worlds, we respect. He didn't need language for her to understand. That stone, with its twin white scars, wasn't a gift. It was a reply. That night, she stayed awake long after the fire dimmed, watching Whisper as he slept on the floor like he used to, arm curled under his head, the faintest hum rising from his chest with every breath. Not a snore, not a growl, a rhythm, like the forest in winter, slow, rooted. In the early hours, she rose and opened the back door. On the porch, where dew had settled thick on the wood, another set of prints waited beside Whisper's. Larger, wider, deeper, only a few. Just enough to say, I was here. Martha knelt beside them and placed her hand in one. The wood was still warm. She didn't cry. But something in her cracked open again, and for the first time since that awful night 15 years ago, she didn't feel haunted. She felt seen. The next day, Whisper didn't speak. But he sang, not with words, with breath, humming low, vibrato hidden in the chest, a tone that moved through the cabin like wind through pine needles. The kind of sound that wasn't meant to be heard with ears, but with bones. She didn't ask what it meant, but she knew where it came from. In the days that followed, she watched him continue his small rituals, cleaning the floor with bundles of dry grass, brushing soot from the stone hearth with a fan of twigs bound in rope he'd made himself. One morning she saw him rearranging the stones again at the window, adding one more to the circle. She asked softly, "Is he watching again?" Whisper didn't answer. But that night when she stepped outside, She saw a single pine cone placed carefully on the porch rail, tied to it with a thin strip of hide, a small tuft of fur, gray and coarse, silvered at the ends. Not Whisper's. And by the base of the stairs, another flat stone. Same shape, same 2 lines, but now with a third, perpendicular, cutting between them. She didn't need translation. 3 paths crossing, acknowledgement, a pact. She looked to the woods and whispered back, "Thank you." 2 nights later, the visitor came closer. She felt it first in the air, not fear. Gravity, something massive approaching, not to enter, just to observe. She waited in the rocker, lantern dimmed. Whisper stood beside her upright, watching the door. Then a sound, not a knock, a breath, right outside the wall. And then movement by the window. Slow, careful. A shadow passed by, huge, deliberate, not hostile, just present. The next morning, the spiral was back in the yard. But this time, it wasn't made of sticks. It was carved into bark, on the tree closest to the porch. 3 tight spirals, underlined, claimed, marked. Whisper stood in front of it for a long time. Then he knelt, pressed both hands to the roots. Martha stood behind him. He reached up and gently pulled her hand down, guiding her palm to the trunk. Side by side, 2 hands, 2 species, 1 rhythm. And in the woods behind them, someone watched. Not as a threat, but as a father. By late August, the forest no longer whispered. It held its breath. The heat had pressed itself deep into the bark of the pines, thickening the air, making everything feel suspended. The crickets sang longer, slower. The birds stopped, announcing the dawn. Even the wind, once playful, moved now with a kind of caution, as if it knew something had returned to these woods that did not belong. The first truck came in early morning. It crawled up the ridge road like a beast unfamiliar with its own weight, tires gnashing at loose gravel, engine coughing in protest. Then came the second, older, red, loud. Its shocks squealed at every bend, though the men inside rode still. Martha watched from the window, her breath held too long in her chest. Whisper stood behind her, back in the shadows, shoulders tense. He didn't need to see them to know. There were 4 of them. 3 men, 1 boy. The oldest among them, heavy-set, jaw square like a cracked cinder block, stepped out first. His boots hit the ground like a decision. He turned slow, scanned the tree line, spat something dark into the grass. His flannel shirt was stained at the shoulders, and a long metal case hung from 1 arm. Not a toolbox, a rifle coffin. The boy stayed in the truck. 17, maybe 18, thin, nervous, hands twitching at the door handle like he didn't want to open it but didn't know how to say no. He looked nothing like the man in the flannel, but his eyes, wide, dim, exhausted, carried a truth that bloodlines don't always need to match. They set up camp less than a mile from the cabin. Derek was the first to reach her. He came without his truck this time. Walked the distance from the ranger station on foot, sweat bleeding through the collar of his shirt, mouth dry with urgency. "They're not locals," he said, leaning against her door frame like the wood might hold more sense than the world outside. "They've got permits to trap nuisance animals, but this—" He shook his head. "This isn't about coyotes." Martha knew, before he even said it. She'd seen it in the way the man in flannel had looked at the trees. Not like they were forest, like they were cover. "Name's Vaughn," Derek added. "Used to run hunts up near the Ozarks. Went off the radar a few years ago. Rumor is he lost a buddy in the woods. Started talking about upright beasts. Folks thought he'd lost it." Martha glanced toward the clearing where Whisper had disappeared minutes earlier. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. That night she didn't sleep. Whisper didn't either. He paced the edge of the yard, slower now, every step thought through. He stopped only once, beside the old cedar stump, and knelt. With his fingertip, he traced a shape into the dirt, a foot, elongated, deep. Then he drew a path, and beside it, a trap. Martha watched from the porch, breath held in the hollow behind her ribs. In the morning, Derek returned. "I saw it," he said. "Steel jaw trap, Fresh oil, planted right near Dry Creek trailhead. That's no coincidence. That's not for hogs. She nodded. Whisper had already known. He didn't wait for permission. By dusk, he was gone. Not vanished. Just moving through the woods like someone who'd remembered his purpose. He didn't leave through the path. He went the long way, where the moss still held the memory of bare feet, where no compass pointed but every bird went silent when he passed. Hours passed. The sun dropped, and then came the gunshot. Martha jumped. Derek, who'd stayed on her porch with a folding chair and a pair of binoculars, stood so fast he knocked the lantern from the rail. Another shot. Closer. Then nothing, until a third. Sharp, short, wrong. Martha's knees gave slightly. She didn't wait. She took the old coat, the one with the broken zipper and the flashlight too dim to matter, and ran. Derek followed. They found him near the western hollow. Whisper, bleeding. A trap snapped tight around his ankle, metal teeth sunk deep in flesh. His body twisted with pain, but he didn't cry out. He didn't thrash. Just breathed hard, holding onto the base of a tree like it was the only thing left keeping him from disappearing completely. Martha fell to her knees beside him. Oh God, she whispered, hands shaking as she reached for the trap. Derek got there second. He knelt, pulled out the release bar from his back pocket. The trap clanged open. Blood poured. Whisper collapsed sideways into Martha's arms, breath shallow, fur soaked dark with red. But he was alive. Behind them, the woods held stillness. Not peace. A pause. Somewhere not far off, a voice shouted. Where'd he go? Another voice, younger. I don't know. I swear I saw him. He was right. Then a third. Shut up, just shut up. And silence again. Back at the cabin, Derek did what he could. Rags, boiled water, whiskey from the back shelf. He wasn't a medic, but he'd patched enough hunters to know what mattered. Clean the wound, keep the pressure, let the body decide the rest. Whisper didn't flinch. Didn't fight, only watched. His eyes stayed on the window. The tree line, like he was waiting. Martha sat beside him, hands locked in prayer, though her lips never moved. Then, the door creaked, but it didn't open. No knock, no footfall. Just a shift in air, a weight. And when she looked up, he was there. The father, the giant. Silhouetted in the dark beyond the porch light, rain wetting his fur, steam rising from his skin like smoke off stone. He stepped forward. No sound, no hesitation. Entered the cabin like he'd built it with his own hands. Martha backed away without realizing it. Derek stayed still, mouth open. The giant knelt. Didn't speak. Didn't roar. Just reached into a pouch slung across his hip and pulled out a small bundle. Dark moss, strips of bark, a resin that smelled like pine and iron. He placed it on the wound. Pressed. Whisper gasped. The old one looked at him, hand on chest. Then on Martha's. A nod. She returned it. Derek's voice, soft. He's healing him. Martha couldn't answer. The father worked without speaking. Tied the poultice in place with a length of sinew. Checked Whisper's eyes. Touched his forehead. Then stood. Back straight. Presence immense. He turned to leave, but paused, faced Derek, and for a moment too long to measure, he stared. Then, hand to chest, slow, intentional, respect. He stepped into the dark and was gone. And Martha, standing in the middle of that small cabin in the middle of a forgotten corner of Arkansas, knew something had shifted. The war hadn't started, but it had come to the edge, and one boy, half human, half wild, all heart, had bought them a little more time, with pain, with courage, with blood. The pines were gold at the edges now, where light touched them just so. Autumn had draped itself over quiet pines without fanfare, trading heat for stillness, urgency for echo. You could feel it in the way the wind carried longer between trees, as if even the forest knew something was coming to an end. Martha stood on the porch with her hands wrapped tight around a chipped mug, though the tea inside had gone cold. She hadn't slept. Not really. Not for days. Whisper had changed again. He was taller now than the door frame. Shoulders thick, arms long. His face older. Not in years. but in something deeper, something ancient that had finally grown into him. There were mornings he stood outside before sunrise, unmoving, listening to things she couldn't hear. He'd hum softly to himself sometimes, low, rhythmic sounds that didn't match any melody she knew. But they meant something. They always had. And then came the sound. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It came from deep in the woods, layered and low, a chorus of throats. Not human, not animal, but something that carried weight. Voices woven like bark, not yelling, not calling, just being. Whisper froze. He was inside when it happened, near the hearth, sorting the stones he always rearranged when something stirred in him. But when he heard it, his head snapped up, his breath hitched, and without a word, he stood. Martha set down her mug. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. He was already moving. He walked the cabin slowly, passing the things he'd once treated like puzzles. The shelf with canned pears, the window he used to fog with his breath just to draw shapes. He passed the chair she used to sit in with him curled at her feet. He stepped to the rocking bench on the porch and placed his hand gently on the armrest. She followed him in silence. He paused at the kitchen table, laid his hand flat on its surface. Then he looked to the corner, where something red hung like a breath caught in time. The scarf, wool, old, slightly faded now from sun. It had belonged to the child Martha never saved. 15 years ago, lost in the woods. That scarf had been the last thing found. It had hung there ever since, folded once over a nail like a memorial no one else could read. Whisper stepped to it, lifted it from the wall. He held it with a reverence that felt almost too much for this world. Then slowly he walked to her and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. Tight, then looser. Then he removed it and pulled it to his chest, folded it once, twice, and held it there. She didn't stop him. His eyes, when they met hers, weren't asking permission. They were saying goodbye, not with regret, with understanding. She reached up, rested her hand on his chest where the scarf now lay, and he covered it with his own. Then he turned toward the door. She followed. Outside, the wind had picked up, but not wild. Just enough to scatter dry pine needles across the clearing, enough to carry scent and meaning into the trees. Whisper stepped down the porch stairs, walked the yard in silence. A full circle, the fire pit, the stacked woodpile, the garden she'd never quite gotten right. Then he stopped at the line where forest met field. He waited. She stayed at the steps. Derek appeared beside her, silent as breath. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In the trees, figures emerged, tall, still, shadowed in twilight. The father, and beside him, another, shorter, thinner, the mother. Her fur lighter, but her eyes just as deep. And when she saw him, she dropped to her knees, not out of pain, but reverence. He stepped forward, paused, then knelt too. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. There was no sound in that moment. No cry, no shout. Just a shared breath between three ancient beings who'd been broken apart too long. The mother reached for him, touched his face with both hands. He leaned into it, then pulled back. He turned to Martha, crossed the clearing, and wrapped both arms around her in a way he never had before. Not clumsy, not uncertain, solid, gentle, final. She held him back with every bone in her body screaming not to let go. But she did. His hand came up, rested on her chest. Then he turned, placed hers against his. Then pointed to the trees and stepped back. She couldn't see clearly now. Tears blurred everything, but she stood tall. She nodded once. He stepped beside the others. Then all three turned and faced her. Together, they raised their hands. Not to wave, but to press palms flat to their own chests. All three, in rhythm, and held. A gesture not born of speech, but meaning. Thanks, respect, belonging. Derek stepped beside her, stared in quiet awe, and placed his hand to his chest too. They disappeared slowly, not into shadow, but into belonging. Their steps didn't echo. The forest received them like a mother receives her child. And then they were gone, not lost. Just home. Martha stood in silence long after the trees had stilled. The clearing felt different now. Not empty. Not abandoned, just full of what had always been waiting. And that night, when she sat by the fire, scarf still warm in her lap, she heard it. Not a cry, not a song, just the soft thud of footsteps in the trees, and the low breath of something watching. Not guarding, not threatening, just remembering. Like her, always. Some stories don't end with answers. They end with understanding. A quiet understanding that lives in the space between breath and memory, between the things we see and the things we choose to protect. Because sometimes what matters most isn't solving the mystery, it's standing beside it, holding space for something wild and wounded to heal, allowing it, in all its strangeness and silence, to be seen not as a threat, but as kin. What we fear is often what we don't yet understand. But when we listen without judgment, when we offer kindness without condition, we open a door. A small, fragile door between two worlds that were never meant to touch, but did. And in that touch, however brief, something sacred passes between us. This story was never just about forest and footsteps. It was about grace, about a kind of courage that doesn't shout, a courage that stays, waits, learns. It's about choosing mercy when the world tells you to turn away. It's about reaching out your hand, even when you're not sure if it will be held or left hanging in the dark. In the end, what survives isn't power. It isn't the loudest voice or the sharpest weapon. What survives is care, the quiet acts, the steady presence, the fire kept burning for someone who may never come back, but who will always know the way home. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes us truly human. Not how we walk, but how we welcome. Not what we conquer, but what we choose to protect. Thank you for walking this path with us, step by step, silence by silence. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you think or feel, or remember someone you once cared for, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Tell us what stayed with you, what you believe still lives in the woods, and what kindness means to you now. And if you'd like to join us again for more stories like this, stories about love, mystery, and the sacred wild, please consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who still believes in the power of empathy. We're building more than just a channel here. We're building a community, and in that, you are always welcome. Even in the quiet, especially there.